Good morning on this Saturday morning. You're watching World News and World Talks. I'm Anna Kalczynska. Good morning. And we'll delve into history now, as 91 years ago, the inhuman policies of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet regime created the so-called Holodomor, or death by hunger. Millions of Ukrainians, men, women and children, suffered and starved to death between 1932 and 1933 because of man-made famine. Traditionally, on the fourth Saturday of November at 4 p.m., Ukrainians all over the world light a symbolic candle of remembrance, honoring the victims of this most horrible tragedy in the history of Ukraine. And joining me now is Andreas Umland, analyst, Swedish Institute of International Affairs think tank. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Good morning.
Thanks for having me.
What is difficult to understand is that the decision by Stalin was totally deliberate. He wanted to erase the independent spirit and Ukrainian identity. So if you could please give us some background as to the reasoning behind Stalin's.
The major target of the Holodomor, this death by hunger, was the Ukrainian peasantry as a source of potential source of instability, and also as the bearer of Ukrainian national identity, national culture. And there were other also at this time hungers in Kazakhstan and let's say among the ethnic Germans. But in Ukraine, we have signs that this was a hunger that was sort of increased by Stalin, and there were no countermeasures, and there were also parallel measures against the Ukrainian intelligentsia. That's why many people argue that this was a form of genocide. While there was hunger in wider areas of the Soviet Union, Stalin had a particular focus here on Ukraine and on destroying the Ukrainian peasantry.
The famous writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn pointed out that this famine came without drought and without a war. So Stalin regime systematically took the grain from Ukrainian farmers and transported it to Russia. Yet the Holodomor was the biggest cover-up for the 20th century. How did the Kremlin conceal its murderous practice for so long?
It did indeed conceal it, and the reports on it were few. But there was also a Western unwillingness by journalists, by governments to report that. There were some exceptions, but there was actually, on the contrary, a tendency of Western intellectuals and journalists going to Moscow and praising Stalinism at a time when millions were indeed dying from hunger, not only in Ukraine, but also in other parts of the Soviet Union. So this was indeed hidden by Stalin, but there was also a failure, I would say, here of many Western intellectuals and journalists.
Yeah, so recognition seems a necessary step to avoid such atrocities in the future, yet the US still declines to declare Holodomor a genocide of the Ukrainian people. You spoke about the unwillingness. Why is that? It seems obvious.
Yes, this indeed is surprising, because many countries around the world have now made official declarations, let's say by the parliament, where they would recognize this large famine as not just an accident, but indeed a genocide, and a targeted genocide against the Ukrainian nation. And why this has not happened yet in the US is also a surprise for me. I'm actually awaiting that happening soon. Otherwise, the scandal would continue.
Mm-hmm. The father of the Convention on Genocide, Rafał Lemkin, a Polish citizen of Jewish origins, coined the term in 1953 and called annihilation of the Ukrainian nation actually a classic example of genocide. I wonder, what is the level of knowledge in Russia, and how come Holodomor still persists as something that is not acknowledged by the Russian citizens as a tragic, murderous fact?
In Russia, there's unfortunately a whole industry of I would say, pseudo-historians, of propagandists who are producing alternative narratives of both Tsarist and Soviet Russia and post-Soviet Russia, where they tell things that are in contradiction to historical research, to mainstream historical interpretation, and where we now have this paradox that Stalin has become a popular politician among younger Russians, not just older Russians who have grown up in the Soviet Union, where you can sort of understand where this comes from. But Stalin has now, as a result of this deliberate falsification of Soviet history, become a popular politician also among younger Russians.
And how about the identity, the Ukrainian identity? How important Holodomor was for feeling by the Ukrainians of possessing an independent and individual identity as regards Russia?
This is a tragedy that has united Ukraine already in the early 1990s. There are other topics in Ukrainian history that are, or that have been, at least been in the past, less unifying. But the topic of Stalinism and of the Holodomor has been always a unifying topic, and that has unified mainly Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East and Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians in the West. And this has also been something that all of Ukraine, not just Western and Central Ukraine, but all of Ukraine has made different from Russians who have an ambivalent or even positive view of Stalin and Stalinism. In Ukraine, the overwhelming majority in all parts of the country has a very critical view of this period of Soviet history.
I wonder also about the state of knowledge today worldwide about Holodomor. How important it is for understanding also the relations between Ukrainians and the Russians. Oftentimes we hear in the West also that maybe there are no such big differences between the Ukrainian language, the Russian language. Those nations have been so close for many, many centuries. So I think that many artists and writers, mainly Polish, like Agnieszka Holland maybe, or Anna Applebaum, wrote and made movies about Holodomor. So they contributed significantly to the raise of awareness regarding Holodomor. But how about the West? Is it really something that they understand? Is it taught on history lessons?
As far as I know, not sufficiently. And there is, I would say, a wider knowledge now among intellectuals, among politicians, diplomats, journalists in the West. But I think the wider Western public knows only very little about it, and even if people know about it, they don't think it was something important, because indeed many more people died under Stalin, not just those between 3 and 4 million Ukrainians who died from hunger in the early 1930s. There were many more victims before and afterwards. So this is sometimes lost, and it's also then one of the factors that this war is misunderstood as a war between really two different people, and not something that the West has brought to Eastern Europe. This is a common theme both of Putin and of many people who are justifying Russia's war, and who do not acknowledge that there are actually two different nations. And the Holodomor, the position to the Holodomor, is one of the topics that divides Russians and Ukrainians, many others as well, the language, the culture, the other parts of historical memory. But the opinion about Holodomor and Stalin is something that is very different in both countries and makes these nations different.
But still, this is something one really cannot understand, right? I mean, You spoke about alternative narrative in Russia, yet all the atrocities committed by Stalin do not change the perception of him in Russia, and he is still considered as a hero. So how is that possible? And not only with all the atrocities and terrible policies done to Ukraine, but also to Russia itself.
Yes, that would be perhaps a question to ask a psychoanalyst rather like myself, a political scientist. This is also a big paradox for me because Stalin has killed many non-Russians. Most non-Russians were Ukrainians, but he has also killed millions of Russians and ethnic Russians, and millions have suffered the Gulag, have been tortured, and so on. But he's still regarded as a hero. Well, the main reason is, of course, the Soviet Union's victory in World War II. But this is still a big paradox, and I think that needs actually a psychologist to explain that, because there is knowledge, and there is at least academic knowledge about that in Russia. There have been hundreds of books published on Stalinism, critical of Stalinism, including on the Holodomor, but somehow they don't make it into the wider public in Russia.
Reflecting on Holodomor was Andreas Umland, analyst of Swedish Institute for International Affairs. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. And that completes this edition of World Talks, but please stay up close as more features and news is coming.